Welcome to our audio program on user stories. In this series, we'll delve into the world of user-centered design and explore how user stories can be a powerful tool for creating exceptional digital experiences. We'll cover a wide range of topics, from the basics of what a user story is to advanced techniques for writing and managing them effectively. Our goal is to equip you with the knowledge and skills you need to harness the power of user stories to drive innovation and deliver products that truly delight your customers. Without any further ado, let's start with the Section 1, Introduction to User Stories.
Ever feel like, some products just totally get you,
Yeah.
And others, you're just like, how did this get made? Like, did anyone even try this? Today, we're doing a deep dive into user stories to see how this one simple tool can make or break a product, really.
Yeah.
We've got some great excerpts from Introduction to User Stories, so
Awesome.
I think this will be a good one. What do you think?
Yeah, let's do it. I'm excited.
Okay. So this source starts off, and I love this, by comparing a user story to a shortcut,
Okay.
to understanding, what users actually need.
Right.
And I mean, who doesn't love a shortcut, right?
Exactly.
But how does this actually work in practice?
Well, think about it this way. Let's say you're building an app like a mobile banking app. You could just jump right into coding features. But how do you know if any of those features are even what your users actually want?
Yeah, you could end up with like this crazy complex app that nobody wants to use.
Exactly. That's where these user stories come in.
Okay.
They force you to think about the who, what, and why
Right.
behind every single feature.
Okay, let's break that down, that who, what, why framework.
Sure.
Because the source gives this example. They say, as a customer, I want to reset my password so that I can regain access to my account.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, sounds straightforward enough, right?
Yeah.
But I'm guessing, knowing this world, there's more to it.
100%. Let's start with the who.
Okay.
Seems obvious, a customer.
Right.
But it's really about understanding their context.
Okay.
Are they super tech savvy or are they easily frustrated? Are they mostly on their phone or are they coming at it from a desktop?
So it's not just like demographics, it's their relationship to this technology.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
So then what might seem pretty self-explanatory,
Right.
like resetting a password.
Yeah.
But again, it's about digging deeper. What does resetting a password actually mean to this customer?
I guess it's not the nitty-gritty of it, but just they want to get back into their account.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that kind of leads us to the why.
Okay.
Which is where it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
It's got their actual motivation, right?
Right.
So in this case, yeah, it's to regain access.
Mhm.
But the why can also help you uncover some underlying needs, frustrations.
Like maybe they're frustrated because they have to reset their password all the time and it makes them feel like the app is insecure.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's a super valuable thing that you wouldn't get if you were just looking at the technical what of resetting a password.
Yeah, I see that. So you're saying that by understanding the why, you can start to see the bigger picture?
Yeah.
Like not just what they're doing, but the emotional stuff.
And also why it matters.
Yeah, and that's where these stories become more than a checklist.
Okay.
They're more like a starting point for a conversation,
Yeah.
like within your team.
Right, because this source mentions, they use the word invitation.
Yes.
Like it's not an instruction, it's an invitation.
It's not go build this.
Right.
It's let's talk about this and figure out what it means. Yeah, so how does that actually work? Like, give me an example.
Okay, so let's go back to our mobile banking app team.
Right.
And we're looking at this password reset story, right?
Okay.
You've got designers, right?
Yeah.
Thinking about how to make the whole process really smooth,
Yeah.
really intuitive,
Right.
Maybe they use clear visuals or like those little micro interactions.
Yeah, because you don't want something that's like clunky,
Right, exactly.
because then it just makes it worse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially if you're already stressed because you're locked out.
Right. Exactly.
And then you've got your developers, right?
Huh. Okay.
And they're thinking about the technical stuff.
Right.
Like security and if it's even possible to do it this way.
Right.
Like can they even implement like two-factor authentication that's both secure but also easy for people to use?
Right. They have to think about all of that.
They have to consider all that stuff.
Yeah.
And how do we make this whole password recovery like
Right.
foolproof?
Right. So it actually works
Exactly.
and it doesn't create more problems.
Right.
But then, like, there's a whole other side too, right?
Right.
What about marketing?
Oh, for sure.
they have to think about this too.
Absolutely, because they have to figure out how to explain this to people
Right.
in a way that makes them trust the app.
Right, and be excited about it.
And be excited about it, yeah. So you see how this simple user story,
Yeah.
it sparks this whole big conversation.
Right, and it's not just one team.
Exactly. It involves everybody.
It's like this multi-level thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's how you get a product that really works for people.
Yeah, it's wild how that one little sentence,
I know.
the as a who, I want what, so that why
Right.
can unlock so much.
Yeah, so much.
That's crazy.
It's really cool. And it doesn't stop there.
Okay.
Like, as you're developing the product,
Right.
the stories can change
Oh, interesting.
because you learn more about your users as you go.
Yeah,
Right?
that makes sense. Okay.
So you have to be flexible.
Right.
Speaking of, this source mentions different types of stories.
Oh, yeah, they talk about epics and themes a bit.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that?
Sure. So epics are like the big overarching goals.
Okay.
Like, imagine a user saying, I want to manage all of my finances in one app.
Right. Okay.
That's huge, right?
Yeah, that's like the dream.
That's the dream. But then you break it down into smaller stories,
Okay.
like our password reset example.
Right, so the epics are like the big picture,
So it's
and then you
gotta be-
break it down into manageable chunks.
Exactly.
Okay, got it. What about themes?
So themes are a way to group the stories.
Okay.
So you might have a theme like, say, security.
Right.
And that would be all the stories about passwords, two-factor authentication,
Got it.
all that stuff that falls under security.
So it's a way to organize, right?
Exactly.
And prioritize.
Yes.
To make sure you're keeping the user in mind.
Exactly. Always focused on the user.
You know, this whole thing is making me think about how I could use this, like, in my own life, you
Yeah.
know?
Oh, yeah. Tell me more about that.
Like, it's not just about building apps, right?
No, not at all.
It's about understanding, like, motivations,
Yes.
why people do things.
100%.
That's useful everywhere.
Oh, yeah, with your family, at work,
Yeah.
anywhere, really.
It's funny how, like, just asking why
Yeah,
can be so powerful, right?
it really is.
Because we get caught up in the what so much that we forget to even ask why we're doing it in the first place.
It's true.
So I feel like this user story thing could apply to more than just apps and stuff, you know?
Oh, absolutely, 100%.
So for everyone listening, like,
Yeah.
how did this affect you?
Right. Well, the next time you're using like an app
Yeah.
or a website even,
Right.
just pay attention to how it makes you feel.
Okay.
Do you feel like they get you?
Okay.
Like, do they know what you need before you even ask?
Right. Right.
Or do you just feel lost?
That's a good point. Because I'm thinking of, like, some apps I use all the time.
Yeah, yeah.
And some are just so much better
Right.
than others, you know?
And you know what?
What?
The ones that just work,
Yeah.
they probably use this whole process, even if we don't realize it.
So we're all benefiting from this.
We are.
Even if we don't even realize it, right?
Yeah, it's like this hidden thing.
That's kind of cool, right?
Yeah,
That, like, just thinking this way makes stuff better for everybody.
it does. And it makes you realize you can use this way of thinking too.
Oh, interesting. Like,
Yeah.
not even just for tech, but for anything.
Exactly. Like if you're trying to get your point across, or even just like understand where your friend's coming from.
So it's all about, like you see, that why question.
Yes. Understanding why.
In trying to see things from their side.
Exactly.
Empathy.
This has been, wow. Okay. This is a whole new way to look at things for me, I think.
Me too. I love it. It's simple, but it changes everything.
Yeah. It's like, how are products made? And then like, wait, I can use this for everything else too.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay, so everyone listening, here's your homework.
Ooh, homework. I like it.
Put on your user story glasses this week.
Yeah.
Like, look around. How is this stuff showing up?
See it in action.
And maybe even try that who, what, why yourself.
Yeah.
See what you learn.
Welcome to Section 2, Key Components of a User Story. In this section, we'll dive into the essential elements: user role, action, goal, and benefit. Let's explore how each part contributes to creating effective and valuable user stories.
Ever put a ton of work into, like, a really thoughtful gift for someone, only for them to open it and you realize they already have one? Or even worse, like, it's something they would never, ever use. Building features for, you know, an app or a website without using user stories can feel kind of like that.
If you're sure.
You might pour your heart and soul into building something really cool and innovative, but if it doesn't actually solve a real problem for the user,
Oh,
yeah,
it's kind of pointless, right?
it's a swing and a miss, exactly. So today, we're doing a deep dive into the world of user stories. We're going to unpack why they're so essential for building products and features that people actually want and use.
And I think what's really cool about user stories is that they completely change the way we think about development. It's less about the, hey, wouldn't it be cool if our product did this mentality, and way more about putting ourselves in the user's shoes, really trying to understand their perspective. Like, what are their biggest pain points? What would make their life easier,
It's almost like flipping a switch in your brain, isn't it? That slight shift in mindset can make a huge difference in the end product. It reminds me of that quote, I think it goes, people don't want to buy a quarter-inch drill, they want a quarter-inch hole.
Well, that's a good one.
User stories, I think, really help us focus on that hole, the actual need the user has, rather than getting caught up in the specifics of the drill, or in our case, the features themselves.
Absolutely. And, a good user story doesn't just tell us what to build. It forces us to figure out why it matters to the person actually using it.
You're totally right, and that why is super important. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's back up a little. For those who might not be familiar with user stories, how would you define what a user story actually is?
Okay, so at its core, a user story is basically like a short, casual description of, let's say, a feature. It could be a functionality, really anything. But it has to be told from the perspective of the user.
So it's not a technical document?
No, not okay.
Got it.
Think of it more like a quick snapshot of what the user's trying to achieve, what their goal is, and ultimately what they want to get out of it.
Okay, so it captures their intent. So instead of a developer saying something like, we need to implement a feature that lets people reset their password, they'd frame it more from the user's point of view.
Exactly. So a user story for that might sound something like this. As a forgetful user, I want to be able to reset my password easily, if I forget it.
Yeah.
So I can log back into my account without any hassle.
That makes perfect sense. It's about understanding the motivation behind the action, not just the technical aspect of resetting a password.
Yeah, exactly. And to make sure these user stories are, clear and actually useful for development, there's this kind of like magic formula we use to structure them.
Oh.
It's user role plus action plus benefit.
Oh.
Kind of like a recipe for building something user-centric.
A recipe, huh? All right, you've got my attention. Let's break down those ingredients. So first up, we have user role. What makes this part so important?
Oh, the user role. That's huge. It's like, when you're casting actors for a movie.
Yeah.
You got to find the perfect fit for the role. Same with user stories. It's not enough to just say, like, the user.
Right. Too broad.
Way too broad. You got to get specific. Who is this person? What are they all about? What are they trying to do?
So, give me an example. How specific are we talking here?
Okay, let's say we're building, like, a music streaming app, right?
Okay, sure.
One user might be, someone who just listens casually, maybe discovers new music on their commute.
Makes sense.
But then you have another user, maybe it's a professional musician, using the app to, like, upload their latest tracks.
Oh, wow.
Totally different needs.
But same app, right.
Right. So by getting clear on who that user is right from the beginning, you're more likely to build something that truly meets their needs.
100%.
Otherwise, you end up with this kind of like Frankenstein app where you're trying to be everything to everyone.
Exactly. And you end up pleasing no one. Like, going back to our music app, imagine if we crammed it full of all these, super technical audio mixing tools.
Yeah.
Great for the pros, but the casual listener who just wants to, hit play and jam out, they'd be totally lost.
Right. Totally. It's like trying to fit a symphony orchestra into a phone booth. You might be able to cram all the instruments in there, but the music's not going to sound so good.
Exactly. A recipe for disaster.
So we've got our user role nailed down. What's next? That's where the action comes in, right?
Mm-hmm.
You got it. And this is where things start to get, really tangible. This is what the user's actually doing in our story.
Okay.
Like, what's their goal? And we express that goal as a specific action verb.
And I'm guessing choosing the right verb here is pretty important.
Oh, it's crucial. A clear, strong action verb gives developers that, laser focus. No room for ambiguity.
Right, because you want everyone on the same page working towards the same goal.
Exactly. It's like if the user story is a compass, right? The action verb, that's your north. It sets the direction for the whole journey.
I love that, a compass. And I bet having that clear direction from the start, it probably saves a lot of headaches later on.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, no one wants to have to, like, rebuild an entire feature from scratch just because there was a miscommunication about what it was supposed to do in the first place.
Oh, the dreaded rework.
Right.
Yeah, no one wants that. So the action is all about being super clear to avoid wasting time and resources.
Exactly. But even with a super clear action, we're not quite done yet.
Right. There's one more piece of the puzzle. The benefit.
Right. And this is where we really dive into the user's motivation.
Okay, this is the part I'm really curious about. So we know who the user is, we know what they're trying to do, but why? Why does it matter? And honestly, sometimes the benefit might seem kind of obvious, right? Like, why do we need to spell it out?
That's a great point. And you're right, sometimes it does seem obvious. But you know what they say.
What's that?
The devil is in the details. What might seem crystal clear to one person could be like a total head scratcher for someone else.
Right, right. And I guess even if something seems obvious, spelling it out can't hurt.
Exactly. And remember, we want our users to have that aha moment, right? That feeling of like, wow, they really get me. Clearly stating the benefit just makes sure everyone's on the same page about what makes this feature so valuable.
Makes sense.
It's like connecting those dots between the action the user's taking and the kind of deeper why behind it.
Oh, okay, I get it. It's about understanding their motivation at a deeper level.
Exactly. And when you can really nail that benefit statement, it unlocks all these like strategic advantages.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, think about it. A strong benefit statement can help product teams prioritize which features to build first. He can help them make those tough design decisions like, do we really need this button here or is it just clutter?
Right, right. Less is more sometimes.
Totally. And it can even help prevent what we call feature creep.
Oh, feature creep. Yeah, I've heard that term before. What is it exactly?
It's basically when you end up with a product like an app that's just overloaded with features.
Oh, I hate that. It's like they just keep adding more and more stuff and you can never find what you're looking for.
Exactly. And you know what's funny? A lot of times those extra features, they're added with good intentions.
Right. Like someone thought it was a good idea at the time.
Yeah, exactly. But if you don't have that clear understanding of the user's core needs and what they're really trying to achieve, it's just so easy to get sidetracked and end up with a product that's trying to do way too much.
So that's where user stories come in, to keep everyone focused.
Totally. They're like guardrails, you know. They keep us on track, make sure we're always building things that deliver real value to the people using our product.
It's almost like having a mission statement for every single feature, right?
I like that. Yeah, it's like a guiding light, making sure everyone's on the same page.
This has been a really interesting deep dive. I never realized how much thought goes into something as seemingly simple as a user story.
Right. It seems so straightforward, but when you break it down, there's actually a lot to it.
Yeah. And you've really highlighted how powerful those three elements, the user role, the action, and the benefit are when they all work together.
Absolutely. It's all about understanding the why behind every single interaction.
Welcome to the Section 3, Invest Criteria. Invest stands for a set of criteria used to assess the quality of a user story. If the story fails to meet one of these criteria, the team may reword it.
Ever catch yourself, like in a wrestling match with an app, and you're just convinced the designers have never even met a real person?
Yeah.
Like, who designed this?
It's a common frustration, right?
Yeah.
And often it really boils down to this disconnect between what users actually need and how the software ends up getting built. And I think that's where understanding user stories can be really, really eye-opening.
Okay. So user stories, are we talking about like those little testimonials you see on websites?
Not quite.
Okay.
So in software development, a user story is this like short, simple description of a feature, but told from the perspective of, you guessed it, the user.
Right.
So it's really about understanding what is someone actually wanting to achieve with the software and why.
So it's more like a behind the scenes blueprint for building features that actually make sense.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And to make these user stories really effective, developers often use something called the INVEST criteria. And this is like a set of guidelines to make sure each story is really well defined and actually leads to a valuable feature.
Invest. Okay. Got it. So it's not just like throwing a bunch of ideas at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Definitely not.
Okay.
It's about being strategic and being user-focused.
Yeah.
So each letter in INVEST, it actually represents a key characteristic of a good user story.
Got it. Okay. I'm hooked. Let's start with I then, independent.
Okay.
What makes a user story stand on its own 2 feet?
So think of it kind of like building a house, right?
Okay.
You wouldn't try to build the entire thing at once, would you? You'd break it down into smaller, more independent tasks, like
Right.
the foundation, the walls, the roof.
Right. Tackle it one step at a time.
Exactly. User stories work in much the same way. Each one should really represent a distinct piece of functionality, something that can be developed and then tested kind of on its own.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, like think about a login and a password reset feature on an app.
Okay, so those are related but also very separate functions within the app.
Precisely. So you should be able to like reset your password without actually having to log in first, right?
Right.
Each function's independent. And this approach not only just makes the development smoother, but it allows teams to actually respond to user feedback a lot more quickly as well.
Gotcha. So by building these like independent blocks, they can be more agile and adapt to changes along the way. I'm starting to see how this user-centric approach really makes the whole process more efficient.
Yeah.
Okay, what's next?
Yeah.
And negotiable.
You got it.
Okay.
And this one might be a bit surprising. So a user story isn't actually like a rigid contract.
Okay.
It's more of a starting point for a conversation, really.
Okay.
Between like the developers, the designers, anyone who's involved with the product.
So there's room for flexibility. It's not just set in stone from day one.
Exactly. Let's say you have a user story that says, as a customer, I want to filter products by category so I can find what I'm looking for. Right. So that's a good start, but then the team can really get into discussing like, what does filtering by category actually entail in the real world?
I see what you mean, yeah. Does it include subcategories?
Right.
How many categories can you choose at once? How's it going to look on the screen? There's a lot to unpack there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So by being negotiable, the team can actually fine-tune that solution, making sure that it aligns with the user needs, the technical feasibility, and really the overall product vision.
So it's a collaborative process, not just, here you go, build this.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay. This is making me think about all the times that I've used a website's filter function, and I've just been totally frustrated. And now I'm realizing maybe they didn't quite nail that negotiable aspect of it.
It's very possible.
Yeah.
And, that can make all the difference between this seamless user experience and then, a really frustrating one. Which leads us perfectly to our next letter, V, for valuable.
Okay.
Arguably, maybe the most important characteristic of them all.
Valuable. Yeah, that's a big one.
Right.
I mean, what's the point of building some feature that no one really wants or needs?
Exactly. It sounds kind of obvious, but you'd be surprised how often it's overlooked, right?
Right.
So every feature should really aim to solve like a real problem for users or actually enhance their experience in some meaningful way.
So it's not enough to just build something that's cool or technically impressive.
Yeah.
It needs to have a purpose,
Right.
like a tangible benefit for the people actually using the software.
Precisely. Imagine a user story about adding a feature where, you can see customer reviews before you buy something online. Clearly valuable, right?
Totally, yeah. It gives me, as the user, way more confidence in my purchase.
Right.
I rely on reviews all the time.
Now, contrast that with a story about, say, refactoring the database schema.
Okay, going a little over my head with that tech jargon.
Right.
But I trust it's important behind the scenes.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. But while it might be essential for the software, like inner workings, it doesn't directly benefit that user's experience, right? So when we're prioritizing these user stories, the ones with like a clear, valuable impact should always be front and center.
Yeah. Prioritize what brings value to the user.
Yeah.
Like those customer reviews that help me make informed decisions.
Exactly.
Okay. On to E, then estimable.
Right.
Okay.
This is where things get a little bit more, technical, but still crucial for the developers. So a user story being estimable means the team can actually determine how much effort, how much time is needed to bring that feature to life.
So being able to estimate the workload accurately is key to meeting deadlines and launching that feature on time.
Exactly. And for a user story to be estimable, it needs to be crystal clear, super well-defined. Think of it like asking a contractor to give you a quote for a renovation, right?
Okay.
If you just tell them you want to spruce up the kitchen without any more specifics, their estimate's going to be like a total shot in the dark.
But if I give them detailed plans, measurements, maybe even like material preferences, then they can provide a much more accurate quote.
Exactly. The same principle applies to these user stories. So a story like, as a user, I want to upload a profile picture to personalize my account. That's easily estimable, right?
Right. It's specific.
Yeah.
And it outlines the desired outcome. Upload a picture, personalize the account.
Precisely. But if the story was just, as a user, I want a personalized account page,
Okay.
that's way too broad.
It is.
What does that even mean?
Right. Yeah.
Does it include custom themes, integrating with like other apps, displaying recent activity? It's like a rabbit hole of possibilities.
Yeah. And without those clear boundaries,
Yes.
those estimations can really balloon.
Totally.
And then that leads to missed deadlines, frustration for everyone.
Exactly. Estimable ensures everyone understands the scope, the effort required, and then that leads to more realistic timelines and just a much smoother development process.
Estimable.
Got it.
Okay, on to S, small.
Oh, okay.
So we're talking bite-sized chunks of functionality here.
You got it. Remember that house analogy we were talking about earlier? We wouldn't try to build the whole thing at once.
Right.
Same goes for user stories, especially when we're dealing with those large, really complex features.
Like building a whole online payment system for an app, you wouldn't tackle that all at once.
Definitely not. I mean, that would be completely overwhelming, right? Instead, you break it down into smaller, much more manageable user stories.
Okay, so instead of build the entire payment systems, like securely store credit card information, process payments through a third-party provider, send email confirmations, and so on.
Exactly. So each of those becomes its own small user story. And this not only makes the development more manageable, but it allows for more frequent delivery of value to the user.
I see, yeah.
Right. So instead of waiting like months for that whole system to be built, you can actually release these smaller features along the way.
Makes sense.
Get feedback, iterate.
Yeah.
Much, much better process.
Okay, it's all starting to come together now.
Good.
Small user stories keep things manageable for the developers. Deliver value to the user more quickly.
Yep.
Okay, so what's the final piece of the puzzle? It's T, right?
Yeah.
Testable.
You got it. And this might seem obvious, but actually defining how we know a story is truly done is absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
And this is where acceptance criteria come in. So these are the specific measurable conditions that must be met for a user story to be considered complete.
So it's not enough to just build the feature. We need a way to actually verify that it works as intended.
Yes.
That it's actually meeting the user's needs.
Exactly.
So it's like we've got this checklist for success, right? It's not enough to just build it. We need to know it works.
Exactly. Yeah. Think about that password reset example we were talking about earlier.
Okay.
So the acceptance criteria might include things like the user receives a password reset email.
Okay.
That link expires after, a certain amount of time.
Right.
And then the user can successfully set a new password and log in. Each of those are testable.
Yeah, we can verify that the email was sent, the link works, and that password reset actually does what it's supposed to.
Exactly.
For guesswork.
It ensures we're not left with these features that kind of work some of the time.
Right.
Clear acceptance criteria are absolutely essential for a smooth user experience.
And it makes you realize that behind those features that we use every single day, there's a whole lot of planning and testing going on to make sure they actually work.
Absolutely. And that is the power of the iInvest criteria. It's a roadmap for building this user-centric software that is not only functional, but it's truly valuable and enjoyable to use.
It's like taking that initial spark of an idea, wouldn't it be cool if this app could do this?
Yeah, totally.
And then turning it into this well-defined, well-executed feature that just works seamlessly.
Absolutely. It's like that quote, genius is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration.
Yeah.
Well, in software development, I think you could say it's 1% inspiration and 99% invest criteria.
I love that.
Right.
So as we kind of wrap up here, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? How can they take this knowledge of Onvest and actually use it in their own digital lives?
That's a great question. So next time you're using an app or browsing a website, just take a moment to really consider the features that you're interacting with, right?
Okay.
Can you see the Onvest principles kind of at play?
Mm-hmm.
Do those features feel well thought out, purposeful, user-friendly?
Or are there those missed opportunities where you're just scratching your head and what were they thinking?
Exactly, yeah. And becoming aware of these Onvest criteria can actually change how you perceive and interact with the digital world around you.
It's like you're letting go of the frustration.
Yeah.
And kind of putting on your developer hat.
Totally.
And analyzing why certain features work and others just completely fall flat.
Exactly. By understanding the why behind the software, you become a more informed and empowered user.
Yeah.
You can start recognizing like those hallmarks of good design and advocating for software that truly meets your needs.
So it's not just about understanding the process. It's about like raising your expectations as a user.
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe you'll even be inspired to kind of contribute to the world of software development, armed with this knowledge of invest and just that passion for building really user-centric experiences.
Now, there's a thought.
Welcome to Section 4, Writing Effective User Stories. In this section, we'll discuss how to keep user stories simple, focus on outcomes, and explore the 3 C's: card, conversation, and confirmation.
So you're psyched about building a product, right? Something people really connect with. Solves a real problem. But how do you make sure you're actually building the right thing? How do those big ideas become something real people can use?
It's tougher than it seems, that's for sure.
Totally, which is why we're diving deep into writing effective user stories today. This guide is like our cheat sheet for getting everyone on the team speaking the same language.
Bridging that gap, yeah, between the idea and actually making it happen.
Exactly. And one thing they hit on right away is simplicity. Sounds obvious, but it's so easy to get lost in the weeds.
Oh, especially with tech stuff. It gets complicated fast.
100%. There's this great example in the guide, really stuck with me. Imagine you're trying to improve the checkout process on, say, your e-commerce site.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
So a bad user story might sound something like, implement a multi-threaded queuing system to reduce latency during peak traffic hours.
Whoa, okay. Lost me at multi-threaded.
Right. It's a mouthful. And doesn't really tell us what the user actually wants.
Yeah, what's the point of all that jargon?
Exactly. A better user story focused on the outcome might be, as a customer, I want to check out fast, even when it's busy, so I can get my order in without a hassle.
Now that I understand.
Right. Suddenly it's clear, you could picture it. Plus, it lets your developers get creative about how to solve it.
Instead of just being told what to build, they can actually problem solve.
Exactly. Which leads to another big idea from the guide. Focus on outcomes, not dictating every little step.
That's a tough one, but so important.
It's about trusting your team to find the best path to the goal, right?
Right. Let's say you need users to log in, yeah.
Yeah.
Instead of saying use Oath 2.0, which most people wouldn't even get.
I have no clue what that is.
You could say, as a user, I want to log in securely with like my social media account so I don't need another password.
Simple. Gets the point across.
Now they can explore different ways to do that, find what works best for your situation.
I love that. So we've got simplicity, focusing on outcomes, and then the guide gets into this cool framework, the 3 C's.
Ah, yes. A roadmap for user story success.
Okay, break it down for us.
It all starts with the card.
Like a virtual sticky note.
Precisely. It's that short, clear description of the user story. Like, as a new user, I want to easily find my way around so I can quickly get the info I need.
Nice and concise.
Exactly. But the card, that's just the beginning. It's not everything. And that's where the second C comes in. Conversation.
That's where things get real, right? It's not just writing it down, it's the back and forth.
Exactly. Conversation. This is where everyone gets in the room, really digs into that user story. Product owner, developers, stakeholders, the whole game.
Okay, so with our new user finding their way around example,
Yeah.
what kind of stuff comes up in that conversation?
Good question. Like, what does easy navigation even mean on this platform, right? Is it about the menus, a big search bar? Maybe you need like little tutorials for new folks?
Right, because every site's different.
Exactly. This is where you hash out those details, make sure everyone's picturing the same thing.
And I bet that's where having different points of view is super valuable.
Absolutely. Developers will be thinking about what's possible technically, designers about the look and feel, product owners got to keep the big picture in mind. Everyone brings something to the table.
Got to make sure it all works together.
Like a puzzle, yeah. And sometimes you got to try a few pieces before you find the right fit.
And that leads us to confirmation, the last C.
You got it. This is defining what done means for this user story, because done can be a slippery word.
Oh, tell me about it.
Right. So this is where you get specific. We call them acceptance criteria. Basically, can you check off that this is done? No more, well, I thought you meant.
Give me an example. For our new user story, what would that sound like?
So we might say a new user can find the pricing page in like 3 clicks or less, or a new user can do the whole tutorial and answer all the questions right. Concrete stuff.
So everyone knows exactly what the finish line looks like.
Yes. And it avoids those situations where suddenly the goalposts have moved. You know what I mean?
Oh, totally. But even with the best user stories, sometimes things change, right? You hit a snag or realize something's not working how you thought it would, because that's life, right? Things change, you got to adapt.
Exactly. And some folks, they think user stories are too rigid, but it's really the opposite.
Because it's more like guidelines, not rules set in stone.
Exactly. And the coolest thing is, this isn't just tea about better software. It's about how the whole team works together.
I like that. Building a better process alongside the product.
Right. You're all on the same page, understand the user, understand each other. It just flows better.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Being able to roll with the punches is so key.
Totally. Totally. It's all about, adapting and refining as you go.
It's like having that shared map, but you're allowed to take a detour if you find a better route.
Exactly. And, the best part about this whole approach, it's not just about, lines of code and features, It's about building a better team while you build the product.
Oh, I totally see that. That shared understanding, empathy for the user, each other.
Right. Makes everything smoother, less friction.
Like you're all rowing the same boat, finally. So as we wrap up here, thinking about user stories, what's the one thing you'd want our listeners to take away?
Ooh, one thing. I'd say don't get stuck trying to make it perfect from the start. Don't be afraid to iterate.
The first draft is never the final product.
Exactly. Just start somewhere. Get those conversations happening, and be open to things changing along the way. It's all part of the process.
Love that. Got to embrace the journey.
Welcome to Section 5, Common Pitfalls in User Story Writing. In this section, we'll cover common challenges, such as writing user stories that are too vague or broad, focusing too much on solutions, and ignoring the user perspective.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. You know how sometimes in software development it feels like everyone's speaking a different language? Well, today we're tackling something that should hopefully make things a little clearer for everyone. We're diving into the world of user stories.
Oh, yeah, user stories. Love a good user story.
So, those deceptively simple statements, they describe what a user wants to be able to do, achieve with a piece of software.
Right.
But it seems like they should be simple, but they're really not, because even small mistakes can really snowball into big problems.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's like the blueprint for the developers, right?
Yeah.
And like any blueprint, you get something wrong, it could be trouble.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can really waste a lot of time and money if a user story isn't written well. And you know what? It leads to a lot of frustration, too, for, everyone involved, really.
So for anyone who's totally new to this whole thing, think of user stories kind of like ordering a coffee.
Right.
Right?
Okay.
You wouldn't just walk up to the barista and say, coffee, please, right? You'd specify what size, what kind of roast you want. Maybe you want an extra shot of espresso. Right. You got to be specific.
Exactly.
User stories are the same way. The more specific, the better.
Totally. The worst thing is getting a user story that's really vague, because then no one knows what to do, what to build, and that just wastes everyone's time and money. It can really derail a project.
Okay, so let's get into what not to do, shall we?
Let's do it.
The first source we looked at, it jumps right into this classic pitfall, this kind of vague vortex. And this is where those user stories, they just totally lack, any specifics.
Yeah.
Like, for example, they use, as a user, I want a better search experience.
Okay.
Which, on the surface, it kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
But imagine if you just got that as a design brief.
Right.
What does better even mean?
Yeah, what does that even mean? It means nothing. It's like saying, make this website prettier. Well, prettier to who? And based on what exactly? You're not giving anyone anything concrete to work with.
So frustrating.
And the thing is, like you said, it's so common. Even experienced teams, sometimes they fall into this trap. They get so caught up in the day-to-day that they forget the basics.
All right, it happens to the best of us, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do we escape this vortex of vagueness?
You got to give them the details.
The source contrasts it ambiguous search story with a much, much better one, and this is how it goes. As a user, I want to be able to filter search results by date so I can find the most recent articles.
There you go.
Now we're talking. Right. Specific.
Exactly.
I've got a specific action there. It's clear what the benefit is. No room for misinterpretation.
And that's what you want. A user story that tells a mini narrative.
I like that. A mini narrative.
Yeah. Instead of just this vague desire, you're saying who wants it, what they want, why they want it. The what, the why, the who. It's like the building block.
The building blocks. So instead of just throwing these kind of vague desires at the developers, we need to give them the full story, the why, the what, all of it.
Exactly. Give them everything they need. Don't make them go searching for more information.
Makes sense. What are some other ways to make sure that a user story is as clear as a bell?
Well, you want to make sure you're focusing on very concrete actions and outcomes. So for example, let's say you're building, I don't know, like an e-commerce site. So instead of saying, as a user, I want a better checkout process, which again is super vague, right?
Right. What does better even mean?
Yeah, exactly. So try something like this. As a user, I want to be able to edit the items in my cart without having to start the checkout process over.
Oh my gosh, yes. See, that's way more specific.
Right.
I can't tell you how many times I have abandoned a cart online because of that exact frustration.
Exactly. You're anticipating those little annoyances that can really derail a customer.
Yeah, it's like those little paper cuts. They just add up,
Yeah. Yes. And here's another one, especially these days, we're all about social media, right? So instead of a user story like, as a user, I want to interact with other users' posts.
Okay.
How about this? As a user, I want to like a post with a single click without having to leave the page I'm on.
Ooh, I like that.
Right.
Nice and specific.
It's a small detail, but it makes all the difference to the developer.
Okay, so we banish the vagueness. We're being super specific now.
Yeah.
What about when we think we know what the developers need? Like, we think we have the perfect solution, and we just want to tell them, do it this way.
Oh, that's a whole other can of worms, isn't it?
I think that might be another pitfall, actually. Speaking of which, let's move on to the next one.
Yeah.
Assuming we know, like, more than the developers, right?
Yeah, it's so easy to fall into that trap.
It's like, almost like we think we can do their jobs better than them.
Right, exactly.
And our source actually gives this great kind of cringy example, like, as a user, I want the system to use a PostgreSQL database for storing my account data so that my information is secure.
Oh my goodness.
Like, I could just imagine a developer rolling their eyes reading that.
Right. It's like going to a chef and telling them, like, how to run their kitchen.
Yeah, like exactly what kind of oven to use.
You're hiring them for their expertise,
Yeah.
Trust their judgment.
So it's like we're so busy telling them how to do their job that we're not actually telling them what we need.
Exactly.
Okay, so instead of playing backseat developer over here, I should be focusing on, like, what the user actually needs.
Right.
Like, in that case, they need their data to be stored securely, right? I shouldn't be telling them what kind of database to use.
Focus on the what, not the how.
But how do you find that balance, though? Like, sometimes it does feel helpful to offer a solution, especially if you have some kind of technical background.
Yeah, and sometimes it is important to share that technical context, especially if it directly impacts the user experience.
Right. Okay.
But the trick is to make sure you're framing it as a need, not a solution.
Okay, I see.
So instead of saying use PostgreSQL, you could say something like, as a user, I need my data to be encrypted, both when it's being sent and when it's being stored.
Oh, okay. So you're still communicating that underlying technical need.
Exactly.
But you're not dictating the solution.
Exactly. You're giving them the why behind the what.
I see. Okay. So are there any red flags we should be looking out for? Like, how do I know if I'm veering into solution obsessed territory?
One big one is if you start throwing in specific technologies or programming languages in your user stories.
Well,
if you see yourself writing things like using React.js or something.
Okay, yeah.
That's a sign you're getting a little too focused on the how.
Gotcha.
Leave that to the experts.
Avoid the jargon, focus on the user, and let the developers do their thing. This has been really helpful, but I feel like we're not quite done yet. Are we? There's more to this. I feel like there's another pitfall lurking around here somewhere.
There is, and this one's a big one. It's all about empathy. You can write the most technically perfect user story in the world.
Okay.
But if you don't have empathy for the user, it's not going to be a good product.
Because at the end of the day, we're building this for actual people. Right?
Exactly.
Not robots.
And that brings us to our next pitfall, which is all about forgetting about the humans who are actually going to be using our software.
Forgetting about the humans.
Yeah.
That's scary. What do we even call this pitfall?
This one we call the empathy eclipse.
The empathy eclipse. Okay.
Yeah, because you're so focused on the technical details, you completely lose sight of the user.
And that's bad.
That's really bad. It's like you said, we're building these products for people to actually use.
Right.
If they don't like it, if it's not easy to use, they're not going to use it. And what's the point of building something no one wants?
Okay, so The source gives this one user story, and it's like, it's technically correct, but it just totally misses the mark when it comes to empathy. And it goes like this. The system will log all user interactions for future reference.
Okay.
Like, okay.
And so wait.
What? Who cares?
Yeah, who is this even for?
Where's the human part of this story?
It's like we built this amazing feature and everyone's like, okay, cool, but why?
Yeah, like I've definitely used websites before where I'm like, this is so confusing.
Right.
Why did they do it this way? It's like they had no idea how a real person was actually going to interact with it.
Yeah, it happens all the time. And that's what happens when you don't have that user empathy, when you're not thinking about the person on the other side of the screen.
So how do we avoid this empathy eclipse? Like, how do we actually put ourselves in the user's shoes?
Well, first of all, you've got to talk to your users.
Right.
Like actually talk to them.
I mean, that makes sense.
Find out what they like, what they don't like. What are their pain points? What are they trying to achieve?
Yeah, like what are their goals?
Exactly. And then you can start to design your software around those needs. There are also some other cool tools you can use, like user personas. Have you heard of those?
User personas, yeah. Tell me more.
So it's basically like creating these fictional characters that represent your ideal users.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. You give them names, backstories, like you figure out what their motivations are, what their frustrations are, and it really helps you to step into their shoes and see the product from their perspective.
So it's like we're writing a story, but instead of writing it for a book, we're writing it for our software.
Exactly.
Okay, I like it. What about empathy maps? Have you ever used one of those?
Empathy maps. Love an empathy map. They're a really great way to visually map out what a user might be thinking, feeling, seeing, hearing, while they're using your product.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And it helps you to really understand their emotional journey.
Their emotional journey, yeah, that's so important. Because, like, if someone's getting frustrated using your software, they're probably not going to keep using it.
Exactly. You want them to have a good experience.
So it's not enough to just build something that works.
Yeah.
It has to feel good to use, too.
Exactly.
I'm getting so much out of this. This is great. So we've learned a lot today about user stories.
We have.
We talked about why they're important, some common pitfalls to avoid. We've got into some really cool tools and techniques. What's like the one big takeaway you hope everyone listening will remember from this deep dive?
I would say at the end of the day, it's all about remembering the humans.
Humans.
Yeah, the people who are actually going to be using the things that we build.
I love that. So it's not just about the code. It's about the people.
Exactly.
Welcome to Section 6, Acceptance Criteria. In this section, we'll explore what acceptance criteria are, how to write clear criteria, and provide some examples.
Picture this, it's the day before my in-laws are coming to visit, and I'm standing in my living room staring at these beige walls that were supposed to be like this serene shade of sky blue.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, and it turns out that sky blue means very different things to me and to my contractor, if only I knew then what I know now about acceptance criteria. Like all those little nuggets of clarity that can save you from project disasters and awkward in-law visits.
Right.
So today we are diving deep into the world of software development to explore this concept that's surprisingly relevant to all of us, even if you've never written a line of code.
Yeah. And, it's funny how often we dive into projects with this grand vision in our heads, but those visions don't always translate to the real world, right? That's where acceptance criteria come in.
Okay, so let's unpack that jargon a little bit. What exactly are acceptance criteria in the simplest terms?
So think of it like ordering a pizza. You wouldn't just tell them, I want a pizza, right? You'd specify the size, the crust, the toppings, all those non-negotiables that determined if you got the pizza you wanted. Acceptance criteria are kind of like that pizza order. But instead of a delicious pie, we're talking about software features, websites, apps, those digital tools we use every day.
So it's like a shared checklist for doneness, like making sure everyone is on the same page from the get-go.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting because this concept applies to so much more than just software.
That's right. You might be wondering, like, why should I care about this if I'm not building the next big app? Well, dear listener, this whole deep dive is all about showing you how acceptance criteria can be a game changer for pretty much anything you're working on.
Yeah, because let's face it, how many times have you delegated a task at work only to get a result that was not quite what you had in mind? Or maybe you've hired someone for a project. Could be anything from landscaping your yard to designing your website. and the final product missed the mark.
Oh, tell me about it. Remember that sky blue paint debacle?
Yeah.
Yeah, clear expectations would have been really helpful there.
Exactly. And that's where, like, clearly defining your acceptance criteria up front can save you from those lost in translation moments.
And this isn't just about avoiding misunderstandings, right? It's about saving time, reducing stress, and getting better outcomes in any project. Whether it's work-related, personal, or even those ambitious goals you set for yourself.
It's like having a shared roadmap that guides everyone towards the same destination. It ensures that everyone is speaking the same language and working towards the same definition of done.
Okay, so we've got like a good grasp on what these acceptance criteria are all about, but you might be wondering, like, why does this really matter for my everyday life?
Well, let's say you set a personal goal, like finally writing that novel you've always dreamed of.
Okay.
How do you define success in a way that's measurable and avoids that whole, well, I started it, ambiguity?
Okay, yeah. That's where those specific testable criteria come in handy.
Right. Absolutely. So instead of write a novel, it becomes write 50,000 words by December 31st. See how much clearer that is. It's specific, it's measurable, and leaves no room for interpretation.
So we're convinced acceptance criteria, good. But how do we actually use them? Our source material gives a great example from the software world. A password reset feature. Let's break that down and see how those acceptance criteria come into play. All right, the password reset, we've all been there frantically trying to log into something, only to realize we've forgotten our password. It's like a moment of mild panic.
Oh, yeah. And in those moments, you just want like a smooth, reliable way to regain access, right? That's where those clear acceptance criteria come into play.
Yeah.
It makes sure that password reset process is as painless as possible.
Okay, so let's think about this from the user's perspective. What needs to happen for that password reset feature to really work?
Well, first and foremost, we need to actually receive that reset link.
Right. It seems obvious, but sometimes the obvious gets overlooked. So clear acceptance criterion could be like, the user receives an email with a reset link after requesting a password reset.
Exactly. And notice how we're focusing on what the user experiences, not just on what the software is trying to do behind the scenes. It's not just about sending an email, right? It's about the user actually receiving it.
Yeah, and we've all had those moments where we're wondering, like, did I even use this email address? So maybe another criterion could be about how quickly that email arrives.
Absolutely. Timeliness is a huge factor in user experience for sure.
Okay, so we've requested the reset, the email arrives promptly, we click that link. What else needs to happen?
Well, for starters, that link shouldn't be valid forever, right? Imagine if someone got a hold of that email and could just reset your password at any time.
Oh gosh, yeah, that's a security nightmare. So our source material really emphasizes the importance of a time limit. A good acceptance criterion here would be the reset link expires after 24 hours, right?
Exactly. That adds a layer of security and makes sure that the user is taking action within a reasonable time frame.
Okay. Link clicked, clock is ticking.
Yeah.
What happens next? We obviously need to be able to actually set that new password.
Right. So another criterion could be something like, the user is able to successfully set a new password after clicking the reset link.
Okay. And let's not forget about feedback. After going through all that, we want to know for sure that our password has been reset, right?
Absolutely. Nothing more frustrating than wondering if you've actually done it right. So a final acceptance criterion could be something like, the system displays a clear confirmation message after the password has been successfully reset.
Okay, so we've walked through this one example of a password reset, and we've already come up with a handful of clear, testable acceptance criteria.
And here's the thing, right? These criteria aren't just random rules. They exist to ensure security, to make the user's life easier, and to achieve that overall goal of helping someone regain access to their account.
Yeah, it's like having that shared understanding, that agreement on what success actually looks like. And I can see how this goes way beyond just software, right? Imagine applying this to a team project at work, or even something like planning a vacation with friends.
Absolutely. Yeah. Defining those key outcomes up front can make all the difference. This example reminds me of a time when I was actually brought in to help with a project that was going way off the rails. It was like everyone had like a different idea of what they were building and what done actually looked like. You know?
Oh, yeah. It's like that feeling of, are we even speaking the same language?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you know what turned things around? We just sat down and like really hashed out those acceptance criteria.
Yeah.
And it wasn't easy. But once everyone agreed on those clear, specific outcomes, it was like a weight lifted off, you know?
Yeah. It's amazing how much clearer things become
Yeah.
when you have those shared goalposts, right?
Absolutely. And you know what else is great about having these well-defined acceptance criteria? That gives a really clear roadmap for testing.
Okay. So it's not just about defining done for the people who are like building it, but also for the people who are making sure it actually works as intended?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Because when everyone knows exactly what to look for, they can catch those little hiccups.
Yeah.
Before they become big problems for the user. It just leads to a much smoother development process and ultimately a better product for everyone.
So instead of just saying like make a website, you'd have specific criteria for how quickly pages load, how the site looks on different devices, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And by catching those issues early on in the process, we save everyone a lot of time, money, and headaches down the road. It's really like a win-win for the developers and for the people using what they're building.
This has been eye-opening for sure. It's amazing how something from like the software development world can be so relevant to, well, everything, right?
It really is. It's the mark of a truly powerful idea, right? It transcends its original context. And it gives us this valuable tool for thinking about any project, any goal, anytime we're working with others to create something new,
Absolutely. So for our listeners who are now like eager to apply this newfound wisdom, what are the key takeaways that they should remember?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway here is just the power of clarity. By taking the time to define our acceptance criteria, those clear, testable outcomes, we set ourselves up for success from the very beginning.
Yeah. It's about moving from like vague notions of done to something much more concrete and actionable.
And it's not just about what needs to be done, right?
Okay.
But also why. Remember our password reset example? Those criteria weren't arbitrary. They were all about security. They were about user experience and making sure that feature actually did its job effectively.
Yeah. It's like that old saying, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail, right? Except here we're planning for success by being crystal clear about what that success actually looks like.
Precisely. And the best part is, this concept isn't limited to the tech world at all. Whether you're assigning a task to a colleague, hiring a contractor to remodel your bathroom, or even setting like personal goals for yourself, the power of well-defined acceptance criteria can really make all the difference.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, here's a little homework assignment for our listeners, okay?
Yeah.
Think about a current project or task that you're working on, big or small, it doesn't matter. Now ask yourself, what are your acceptance criteria? Have you clearly defined them? And perhaps even more importantly, are they shared and understood by everyone involved?
That's such a good question to reflect on. Because when we take the time to define those criteria, to get everyone on the same page right from the start, we set ourselves up for smoother collaboration, less stress, and ultimately better results in all areas of our lives.
Welcome to Section 7, Prioritization Techniques. In this section, we'll dive into the Moscow W method, the value versus effort matrix, and more.
Ever feel like you're drowning in a sea of sticky notes, each one a feature your users absolutely need, like yesterday?
You're speaking my language. It's the product manager's dilemma, a constant influx of possibilities, but finite time and resources.
And that, my friend, is why we're diving into the world of prioritization frameworks today. You sent over some fascinating research about the Moscow method and the value versus effort matrix, and frankly, my to-do list is already quaking in its boots.
Good. A little strategic fear never hurt anyone. What's fascinating about these frameworks is that they were literally forged in the fires of product development think, high-stakes decisions, constant pressure to innovate. But here's the kicker, they work wonders for just about any decision-making process, even outside of tech.
Okay, you've piqued my interest. Before we unveil these secret weapons, let's set the scene. What's the core problem these prioritization methods are trying to solve?
Imagine this. You're a product manager, staring down a backlog overflowing with feature requests, bug fixes, and those nice-to-haves everyone swears will make the product a unicorn. Sound familiar?
Painfully so. It's like standing at an all-you-can-eat buffet after a week-long fast. Everything looks good, but, you can't possibly try it all without disastrous consequences.
Precisely. And just like a poor buffet strategy leads to indigestion, poor prioritization in the product development world can lead to missed deadlines, wasted resources, and ultimately a product that falls flat.
So no pressure then. Thankfully, we have the Moscow method to the rescue. From my understanding, it's all about categorizing tasks with a ruthless efficiency, sort of like a triage system for our to-do lists, right?
Exactly. Think of Moscow as that no-nonsense triage nurse, bringing order to the chaos of a busy emergency room. Instead of everything screaming for attention at once, Moscow helps us categorize tasks into 4 distinct buckets: must have, should have, could have, and won't have.
Okay, let's unpack this acronym starting with must have. These are the non-negotiables, the features without which our product simply wouldn't function, right?
You nailed it. Think of these as the foundation of your product, like the ability for users to log in or complete a purchase. Our source, for example, highlights how critical a secure and reliable login system is in today's online world. Without it, nothing else matters. It's about identifying those make-or-break features that are absolutely essential for launch or for the core functionality of the product.
So in the context of product development, skipping a must-have is like forgetting to put the engine in your shiny new car, a recipe for disaster.
A tragically accurate analogy. And that's why this framework is so powerful. It forces us to ask those tough questions early on, ensuring we're building on a solid foundation. Now, let's move on to should have features that are important, but not necessarily deal breakers.
All right, should have the features that would be fantastic to have, but could potentially be pushed to a later release if we're facing a time crunch.
You've got it. These features enhance the user experience, but aren't absolutely critical for the core functionality of the product. Think of it like this. You're building a note-taking app. A should-have feature might be the ability to embed images or create voice memos, features that add value, but aren't essential to the app's primary purpose.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've covered must-have and should-have. What about could-have? This is where things start to get really interesting, right?
Absolutely. Could have is where we acknowledge those tempting extras, the bells and whistles, that would be nice to have, but might fall by the wayside when push comes to shove.
So this is where we park those pie-in-the-sky features, the ones our developers dream about during late-night coding sessions.
Exactly. Features that could potentially enhance the product but aren't essential for launch or even for a future iteration. Our research uses the example of a team wanting to integrate a cutting-edge AI feature into their project management software. It's a cool idea, but is it feasible given their current resources and timeline? Probably not.
So it's not about dismissing these ideas altogether, but rather about acknowledging that they might not be the best use of our time and resources at this particular moment.
Precisely. It's about having the discipline to say, we love this idea, but it's not in the cards right now. This category helps prevent scope creep and ensures the team stays laser-focused on what truly matters, which conveniently leads us to the final category, won't have.
Ah, the graveyard of good intentions. I imagine this is where those nice-to-have features go to die a slow and painful death.
You could say that, but in reality, it's about making conscious decisions about what we're not going to do. This is crucial for setting realistic expectations and avoiding that dreaded feeling of being overwhelmed.
So in the case of our note-taking app, the won't have category might include features like a built-in Pomodoro timer or integration with a meme generator, cool additions, but ultimately outside the scope of our core product vision.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we can't do everything at once and making strategic decisions about where to focus our energy. Now I know what you're thinking. This is all well and good, but what happens when we have multiple must-have features? How do we decide which ones take priority?
You read my mind. It feels like we need another layer of prioritization here, a way to fine-tune our decision-making within each category.
You're way ahead of me. And you're absolutely right. That's where the value versus effort matrix comes in, adding a whole new dimension to our prioritization strategy.
Okay, I'm already starting to see how powerful this combination can be. So, value versus effort. I'm guessing effort is pretty self-explanatory. We're talking time, resources, maybe even the emotional toll of tackling a particularly hairy challenge.
You got it. It's about, honestly, assessing the resources a task demands. But value can be a bit more nuanced, especially in the fast-paced world of product development.
Right, because value in this context isn't just about dollars and cents, is it?
Exactly. While revenue potential is always a factor, we also need to consider things like user satisfaction, brand perception, even alignment with the company's long-term vision. Sometimes a feature that seems low value from a purely financial standpoint can be incredibly valuable for building brand loyalty or attracting a new user base.
So we're talking about taking a holistic view of value, considering all the potential benefits, both tangible and intangible. I like it. Now, how does this value versus effort thing actually work in practice? I'm a visual learner, so if there's a graph involved, don't hold back.
You know, I love a good graph. Imagine a simple 4-quadrant grid. We've got value on one axis, from low to high, and effort on the other, also ranging from low to high. This creates 4 distinct quadrants, each representing a different type of task.
Okay, let's bring down these quadrants, starting with my personal favorite. High value, low effort. These are the quick wins, the low-hanging fruit that can make a big impact, right?
Absolutely. These are the tasks we want to prioritize whenever possible. In product development, this might be something like fixing a small bug that's causing a lot of user frustration.
Yeah.
It might only take a developer an hour to fix, but the impact on user satisfaction could be huge.
And those positive user reviews translate to higher App Store rankings, which could lead to more downloads, more users, more revenue. I see where you're going with this.
See? You're natural. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the dreaded low-value, high-effort quadrant. Tasks that often feel like we're wading through quicksand.
Ah, yes, the resource suckers, the productivity black holes. I have a feeling I'm a pro at accidentally prioritizing these.
You're not alone. But awareness is the first step. Think about a time when you spent hours manually updating spreadsheets, when a simple automation script could have done it in minutes. Or maybe you slaved over a presentation design only to have your boss completely change the direction at the last minute.
Ouch, that hurts. But it's a perfect example. All effort, very little reward. It sounds like identifying these tasks early on is crucial for protecting our time and sanity.
Exactly. And that's where these frameworks really shine. They give us a framework for making those tough calls and saying no to those tempting but ultimately unproductive tasks.
So far, we've covered the extremes. What about those tasks that fall somewhere in between? Right, because not everything is so black and white. What about those tasks that are, let's say, high value but also high effort? These feel like the long game projects, the ones that require a significant upfront investment but have the potential for a huge payoff down the road.
You're spot on. This quadrant is where we find those game-changing features, the ones that could catapult a product to the next level. Think of a mobile banking app adding a feature that allows users to invest in the stock market. It's a complex feature to develop, requiring significant time and resources, but the potential rewards are substantial.
Right, it's not just about adding a new feature, it's about potentially tapping into a whole new market and revolutionizing the way people manage their money. No big deal.
Exactly. But you're right, these are the types of features that require careful consideration. Does the potential value outweigh the risks and the resources required? That's the million-dollar question. And that brings us to our final quadrant: low value, low effort.
These feel like the nice-to-have features, the ones that might improve the user experience in a small way, but aren't going to dramatically move the needle.
That's a great way to put it. In the context of our mobile banking app, this might be something like adding a dark mode option or allowing users to customize the app icon. Small improvements, relatively easy to implement, but not essential to the core functionality of the app.
Okay, so we've categorized our tasks, both in terms of their essentialness using Moscow and now by their value and effort. But how do these two systems work together? That's what I'm dying to know.
That's the million-dollar question. And it's where things get really interesting. Remember how we talked about having multiple must-have features? Let's see, we've got 3 implementing two-factor authentication for improved security, redesigning the user onboarding flow, and fixing a critical bug that's causing app crashes. All essential. But where do we even begin?
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. Tell me more. Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. Tell me more.
Well, this is where our trustee value versus effort matrix comes into play.
Okay.
Let's break it down.
Okay.
Two-factor authentication, definitely high value in terms of security and user trust, but it could also be a high-effort endeavor for the development team.
Right. You've got to integrate with potentially multiple authentication apps, consider different user devices. It's not a walk in the park.
Right.
What about the user onboarding redesign?
Another potentially high-impact task, a smooth onboarding process. It's crucial for user retention.
Right.
But again, depending on how extensive the redesign needs to be, it could fall into that high-effort quadrant as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then there's the critical bug fix, high value, because nobody likes a crashing app, but hopefully a lower effort fix if we can pinpoint the source of the issue quickly.
Exactly. See how we're using the value versus effort matrix to prioritize even within our must-have category. In this case, tackling that critical bug fix first might be the smartest move.
Okay.
It quickly addresses a major pain point for users and frees up the development team to focus on those more complex, high-value features like two-factor authentication.
So it's not just about blindly following a checklist, it's about understanding the nuances of each task, the potential impact and the resources required, and then making strategic decisions based on that information.
You've hit the nail on the head. And that's the beauty of having these frameworks in our toolkit.
Yeah.
They empower us to move beyond that feeling of everything is important and embrace a more strategic, data-driven approach to prioritization.
It's like we're switching from a whack-a-mole approach to project management to something more like a well-choreographed dance, where we're anticipating the next move and prioritizing our steps accordingly.
I love that analogy. And just like any good dancer will tell you, the key is to find the rhythm that works best for you.
Yeah.
There's no one-size-fits-all approach here.
Right.
Experiment with these frameworks, see what resonates with you and your team, and don't be afraid to adapt them to fit your unique needs.
So if our listeners could take away just one thing from today's deep dive, what would it be?
That they have the power to take control of their priorities.
Mm-hmm.
Whether they're building a product, managing a team, or just trying to get through their to-do list without having a meltdown.
And that sometimes the most productive thing we can do is to pause, assess, and make a conscious choice about what truly deserves our time and attention.
Right. It's about working smarter, not harder.
Yes.
And sometimes that means saying no to the good so we can say yes to the great.
I think that's the perfect note to end on, a resounding yes to strategic thinking, thoughtful prioritization, and maybe a well-deserved break after we've tackled our most important tasks, of course.
Agreed.
Welcome to the Section 8, Estimating User Stories. We will cover techniques like story points, planning poker, and more.
Ever gotten really into a project and then somewhere midway through you realize, oh my gosh, this is way more work than I thought it was going to be?
Happens all the time.
Yeah, me too. But imagine if you're building software and there are teams of people and everyone's waiting on everyone else, and then someone's like, oh yeah, this is going to take way longer. That's actually what we're talking about today, kind of. It's how agile teams, they use these things called story points and something called planning poker to kind of get a handle on how much effort is something really going to take, but without, needing giant spreadsheets full of hours and stuff.
Yeah, it's really about sort of embracing the inherent uncertainty in software development.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you start out trying to define these really specific timelines and estimates, it's kind of like, trying to predict the exact date and time that a seed is going to sprout.
Okay, yeah.
There's just too many variables at play.
So many things could happen. Okay, that makes sense. So instead of saying this is going to take exactly 3 hours, they use these story points. I'm guessing it's not about writing a literal story though, right?
No novels being written here.
Yeah, good.
It's more about this idea of relative sizing.
Hmm.
So think about it like this. You wouldn't measure the distance between cities in inches.
Right.
You'd use miles or kilometers. Story points are kind of like our miles for effort.
So instead of this is going to take 3 hours, it's more like this is bigger than this other thing or smaller.
Exactly. It's about comparing.
Yeah.
And what's really powerful about this approach is that it goes beyond just pure coding time.
Well,
think about it. Remember that time that, that bug you spent ages trying to fix?
Oh, yeah.
Or, all those back and forth emails, trying to get everyone on the same page about how something should work?
Uh-huh.
Story points help you take all of that into account, not just the actual fingers on keyboard time.
Okay, that's smart. The thing we were looking at for this, it talked about building an online shopping app, and one task is let's make the search bar, and the other one is let's make the whole discount code system.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, even I know that the discount code thing is going to be way more complicated.
Way more. So the team might look at those two things and say, okay, the search bar, we'll call that a 3 in terms of effort.
Right.
And then this discount code thing, that's a 5.
Okay.
But here's the thing. Those numbers, they don't mean anything in isolation.
Yeah.
Another team's 3 could be this team's 5. It all depends on their experience and their internal calibration.
Oh, so it's their own language for effort almost, based on what they know is tough for them.
Precisely. And that's really powerful because it forces those conversations to happen early on, right?
Yeah.
Okay, what does a 5 really mean to us?
Mm-hmm.
Which is way better than that last minute panic when someone's like, oh, I thought this was going to be way easier.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So you're saying this is not just some techie thing. This actually impacts how likely a project is to finish on time.
Well, I can't promise you'll never miss a deadline, but
Okay.
But it definitely helps teams be more realistic. You see, once they've got these story points kind of figured out, they start tracking what's called their velocity.
Velocity.
Which is basically how many of these story points they can, on average, handle within what's called a sprint, a set period of work.
So knowing whether you can bake 1 cake per hour or 5 cakes, and then promising realistic amounts to your friends.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Except instead of delicious cake, we're talking about, working software.
Okay, still good.
But understanding that velocity is what lets a team set goals that are actually achievable. So you might not eliminate missed deadlines, but you make them way less likely.
Okay, that's what I like to hear. So we've talked about how teams like SSUP, the work with story points, but then how do they actually decide on those numbers? I hear there are cards involved.
Yes.
Yes.
This is where the fun begins. It's time for planning poker.
Okay.
And yes, it does involve cards, but I promise it's not as intimidating as it sounds. It's much more about collaboration and uncovering those hidden gotchas. It's not about gambling, I promise.
Okay, now you've got my attention. So how does a round of this planning poker thing actually work? Like, walk me through it.
All right, so picture this. You've got the team gathered together. Maybe they're all virtual, maybe they're in person, and they've all got their, metaphorical poker faces on. But instead of betting chips, they're holding cards. And on these cards are written different story point values. So the team lead, they describe a new feature. Let's say for our online shopping app, we need to build a password reset function.
Okay, sounds simple enough.
Right.
I bet they'd all be putting down like a 1 for that.
And that's where things get interesting. Because what seems simple on the surface often has hidden depth.
Sure.
In this case, the developer might realize, hold on, to make this really secure, we need to build in two-factor authentication as well.
Oh.
And that, my friend, adds a whole new layer of complexity.
Yeah, so what seems like a quick, oh yeah, password reset, no problem, suddenly is like, oh, we have to build this whole system. I see why those conversations about what a 3 versus a 5 means are so important.
Exactly. And that's exactly what planning poker helps to surface. So now everyone's had a chance to think about the task, think about those potential challenges, and they each privately choose a card that represents their story point estimate.
Okay, no drama yet.
Not yet.
But what happens next? Does everyone flip their card over at the same time?
You got it. On the count of 3, all the cards go face up. And this is where the real magic of planning poker happens.
Okay.
Because if all the cards are pretty similar,
Right.
like everyone's holding up 3s and 5s, well then, the team has a pretty shared understanding of how complex this task is.
But what if there's like a big difference? Like what if one person's holding up a 2 and someone else slams down an 8?
That's where the real value comes in. That's not something to be afraid of. That difference in estimates is like a big flashing sign saying, hold on, there is a fundamental misunderstanding here.
That's when the real discussion starts, right?
Exactly. Like instead of just blindly moving forward with someone's guess, now the team can actually talk it through.
Yeah.
The person with the 2, they might say, oh, well, I did something similar last month. I think this will be quick. But the person holding the 8, they might say, hold on, have we considered this other thing? This could be tricky.
So it's like a built-in reality check.
Exactly. Saves a lot of headaches down the road. And the best part is, by having that open conversation, you get a much more accurate shared understanding of what the work really involves. Plus, it stops those senior devs from accidentally, dominating the room.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
With planning poker, everyone's voice, it carries equal weight. And that builds ownership.
Oh, I like that. That reminds me of this one time our team, we were working on this project and we totally misjudged the effort on this one feature. And we hadn't really sat down and talked it through, missed our deadline by a mile.
Oh, yeah.
We were scrambling to catch up. I wish we'd had this planning poker thing back then.
Right. It's funny how such a simple thing can make a difference. And it's not just about better estimates. It's about that team culture, right?
Yeah.
When people feel safe speaking up, that's when you catch those gotchas early and come up with creative solutions together.
So it's not just about estimating, it's like team building almost.
Exactly. That's something any team can use, by the way. It doesn't have to be software, marketing campaign, even planning a wedding.
Okay, I'm sold. Planning poker sounds awesome. But bringing it back to our listeners, right? What are some key takeaways for them, even if they're not coding all day?
Well, first things first, remember, estimating any project, it's not an exact science. There will always be surprises. It's about making good decisions despite that.
So ditch the crystal ball, embrace the chaos.
Exactly. And that's where these tools like story points, planning poker, they come in handy. Don't aim for perfection, aim for transparency, collaboration, talk to each other. Don't be afraid to adjust as you go.
Makes sense. But what about if it's just me? Like my own to-do list, not a whole team?
You can still use that velocity idea. Look back at your past work. How much do you actually get done in a week, realistically?
Oh, that's a good point.
Once you know your unW on velocity, you can set better deadlines for yourself, right? Avoid overcommitting.
I'm so guilty of that.
Aren't we all? And when you do have those big, scary tasks, break them down. Smaller chunks are way less intimidating.
Bite-sized pieces, right?
Exactly. And just like with planning poker, don't be afraid to ask for a second opinion. Someone else might spot something you missed.
This has been honestly eye-opening. It's like a whole new language for getting things done. But before we go, let's recap those key differences. Story points versus planning poker.
Absolutely. It's not really about picking one or the other, see? Story points, they're about that shared language, right? How much effort does something take? They let us compare apples to apples, set realistic goals. Planning poker is more about the H&W. How do we, as a team, actually figure those points out?
So story points are like the foundation, and planning poker is the tool we use to build on that.
Perfect analogy. Story points are the language, planning poker is the conversation.
I like it. So when should a team, bust out the planning poker cards?
It's especially helpful when a team is new to this whole agile thing. Or if the project is just, really complex, lots of unknowns.
So basically, if you want better estimates, better teamwork, and maybe have a little fun while you're at it, planning poker.
Exactly. It's about working smarter, not harder. Using the brain power of the whole team.
Wow, this has been, like I said, eye-opening. Who knew there was so much to say about, just figuring out how long work takes?
Right. But it makes a huge difference.
It really does. So as we wrap up here, what's the one big thing you want everyone listening to remember about all this?
I think it's this. Don't stress about getting those estimates perfectly right.
Okay.
Because that's never going to happen. It's more about, like we were saying, the way you work together.
Yeah.
Talking, adjusting as you go, and always trying to get a little bit better at it. That's what makes a team truly agile.
Love it. Working smarter, not harder. And making sure everyone's voice is heard. So, listeners, next time you're looking at a big, scary project, remember what we've learned. Story points to compare the work, planning poker to get everyone on the same page, and never, ever underestimate good old-fashioned communication.
Couldn't agree more. Who knows, you might even find that this whole estimating thing, it's not so bad after all. Maybe even kind of fun.
Welcome to Section 9. In this section, we'll discuss splitting user stories, including why and how to split stories, and more.
Ever feel like that to-do list just keeps multiplying? Like, seriously, you cross one thing off and two more magically appear in its place.
It's the never-ending to-do list dilemma.
In the world of software, though, they've got a superpower for that. It's called splitting user stories. And guess what? It's not just for techies.
Definitely not. This is one of those concepts that transcends the tech world,
We're diving into how this agile technique can help you conquer a new project.
Whether you're coding an app or, just trying to organize your life, which, let's be real, can feel like a monumental task in itself sometimes.
Okay, so we've got this guide on splitting user stories. And I'll admit, when I first saw the title, I was like, ugh, this sounds a bit dry.
It's a little jargony, I get it.
But then I started thinking about it, and it's like, wait a minute. This is how we already DO things. We just don't have a fancy name for it.
Exactly. It's funny how often the simplest ideas are the most powerful, right?
So before we get all artsy and philosophical on this, let's make sure we're on the same page. What exactly a user story in this context?
In the simplest terms, it's a description of something specific a user wants to be able to do with a piece of software.
Okay, so it's all about functionality from a user's perspective.
Precisely. It's about understanding their goals, their needs, and translating those into actionable items.
And I'm guessing these actionable items shouldn't be giant, overwhelming undertakings.
You're reading my mind. Size really does matter here. A small, well-defined user story is like that single, perfectly cut brick in a wall. But a huge, vague story, what they call an epic, that's like trying to work with a giant, unwieldy boulder. Recipe for disaster.
And I'm guessing that's where this whole splitting thing comes in, turning those boulders into manageable bricks.
Precisely. And it's not just about making things smaller for the sake of it. It's about splitting them strategically.
Strategically, okay. So there's a method to this madness. We're not just randomly hacking away at these stories.
Exactly. There's an art to it, but the good news is it's a learnable art.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So this isn't just about software, is it? This is about project management at its core.
100%. You're hitting the nail on the head.
Because whether you're building an app or, say, planning a wedding, the same principles apply.
Absolutely. Break it down, make it manageable, and you'll thank yourself later.
This guide highlights some pretty compelling benefits. Faster feedback, better planning, reduced risk, and quicker delivery of value. Let's unpack those, shall we? Starting with faster feedback. because who doesn't love good feedback, especially when it comes quickly?
Oh, I'm all about that instant gratification. But seriously, feedback is crucial in any project. And the faster you get it, the better.
Imagine you're building a house, right? And you only get feedback once it's completely finished.
Oh, that's my nightmare. Talk about too little, too late.
What are the chances you'll have to make some pretty major time-consuming changes?
Pretty high, I'd say, especially if you've ever lived through a renovation, which, full disclosure, I have, never again.
But now imagine if you're getting feedback throughout the process.
Okay, I like where you're going with this. So instead of waiting till the bitter end, you're checking in, course correcting.
After the foundation, after framing the walls, and so on, you can prevent those major headaches down the line. That's the beauty of splitting those user stories.
It's like taking a detour early on, instead of realizing you've driven 100 miles in the wrong direction.
So it's not just about speed, it's about building the right thing right from the start.
You got it. It's about agility, adaptability, all those good things.
Okay, what about better planning? That sounds like something we could all use a little more of.
Who couldn't? Let's be real, planning is often the least glamorous part, but it's the foundation for everything else.
And with a good plan, you're less likely to run into those, oh shoot, I didn't think of that moments.
Exactly. And when you break down a big task into those smaller user stories, you suddenly have a much clearer picture of what needs to be done. It's like having a detailed map instead of just a vague idea of where you're going.
And with a good map, you can estimate the journey, pack the right supplies, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Smaller tasks are just inherently easier to estimate, which means you can create more realistic timelines.
Allocate resources more efficiently.
You got it. And let's not forget avoiding those budget-busting surprises. Nobody wants that.
Music to my ears. Okay, reduced risk, always a good thing. How does splitting stories help us dodge those project pitfalls?
Remember that house we're building?
Our metaphorical house, yeah.
Let's say the entire foundation is faulty.
Uh-oh, that's not good.
Major problem, right? But if you've built it in smaller sections and only one section has an issue, it's a much easier fix.
Because you've contained the problem. You haven't brought the whole project crashing down around you.
Exactly. It's like having those firewalls in a building, you know? One section might be affected, but the rest is still standing.
Okay, so less stress, fewer sleepless nights. I can definitely get behind that.
Yeah.
All right, last but not least, let's talk about delivering value faster. This is where it all comes together.
It is. It's like, why wait until the very end to experience the benefits of all your hard work?
Right, because in the real world, we often need to see some kind of progress, some tangible results to stay motivated.
Exactly. And splitting those stories allows you to deliver usable chunks of functionality along the way. It's like getting those little dopamine hits as you go.
So not only are you getting feedback faster, but you're actually seeing working parts of the project, like in action.
Precisely. And that does wonders for morale, let me tell you. Plus, it allows for early testing, validation. You can catch those hiccups before they become major roadblocks.
It's like, why wait for the entire feast when you can enjoy those appetizers along the way, right?
Exactly. It's all about those small wins that add up to big victories.
Okay, I'm convinced. Splitting user stories is officially on my list of productivity hacks. But let's get practical, shall we? How do we actually do it? How do you know the best way to break down those stories?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It's where the rubber meets the road. But luckily, our guide provides some really helpful techniques, like a toolbox full of splitting superpowers.
Okay, I'm all ears. Hit me with those superpowers.
All right, the first one we'll call workflow steps.
Workflow steps. Okay, I'm taking notes here.
It's all about identifying the natural steps within a process and turning each step into its own story.
So it's like taking a process and breaking it down into its individual components. Give me an example. I need to visualize this.
Okay, imagine you're designing a website where people can book appointments online, like for a doctor or a salon.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Now think about the steps involved in that process. A user would need to be able to browse available appointments, select a time slot, provide their information.
Confirm the booking.
Yeah.
Maybe even make a payment.
You got it. Each of those steps could be its own user story. User can view available appointments, user can select a time slot, user can provide contact information, and so on.
It's like a checklist for building a feature. I like it. Okay, workflow steps, check. What's our next superpower?
Next up is user roles and inputs.
User roles. Okay, this sounds interesting.
This one's especially handy when you have different types of users interacting with the system, each with their own unique needs.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going.
Think of like an online banking app. You have regular users who can check balances, transfer funds, pay bills, that sort of thing. But then you have bank administrators who need to access and manage accounts, handle security issues, all that jazz.
Totally different experiences within the same app.
Exactly. So instead of having a vague story like users can manage accounts, which is, let's face it, not very helpful.
Not specific at all.
You'd split it based on roles. You'd have regular user can view account balance, administrator can flag suspicious activity, and so on. It ensures that you're building the right functionality for the right people.
Love it. Makes perfect sense. Okay, what else is in this superpower toolkit?
The third one is data or input types.
Data or input types. Okay, adding that to my list.
This one's all about looking at the types of information your system needs to handle and splitting those stories accordingly.
Okay, I think I'm getting the hang of this, but an example would definitely help solidify it.
Sure thing. Let's say you're building a search function for an online store. Customers might search by product name, by category, by brand.
By price range. Don't forget price range.
Right. Or even by color or size.
So many options.
And each of those search types might require different algorithms, different data structures, different ways of presenting the results.
Instead of one monster search story, you'd have customer can search by product name. Customer can filter by price range. I'm picking it up.
You're a natural at this.
I'm feeling empowered already.
And the final technique we'll call output and display.
Output and display. Hit me with it.
This one's all about the different ways users might want to view or interact with information.
Okay, give me an example for this one. I'm ready.
Imagine you're building a report generation feature. Some users might want a simple summary. Others might want a detailed breakdown.
And still others might want a visual representation, like a chart or graph.
Exactly. So you'd have stories like generate PDF summary, generate detailed spreadsheet, display data visually.
This is making me realize how much thought goes into building software that truly works for people. Like, it's not just about the code itself. It's about understanding how people actually use it. This is amazing. We got workflow steps, user roles, data types, output, and display.
My brain is buzzing with possibilities here. I'm already thinking about how to apply these to, like, planning my next vacation.
See? I told you it translates. It's not just about lines of code. It's a way of thinking, a framework for tackling complexity.
A framework for life, really.
And the more you practice splitting those stories, the sharper your instincts will become. You'll start to see those natural breaking points in any project, in any aspect of your life.
Okay, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's loop back to some of the examples from the guide. Seeing these techniques in action will really help solidify it, you know? Absolutely. Let's revisit that online content moderation example where we talked about an admin reviewing user-generated content.
Right, because that could be a huge EE task depending on the platform.
Exactly. Instead of one giant story like admin can moderate content, which is about as helpful as, you know,
a screen door on a submarine.
Love it. That's a good one. But yeah, we can break it down using those workflow steps we talked about.
Okay, so what would those smaller stories look like?
You could have admin can view pending content, then admin can approve or reject content, and finally, admin can provide feedback to the user.
So each step is a manageable task, something you can track, test, refine independently.
Exactly. It's all about creating those clear, actionable steps.
It's like those cooking shows where they have all the ingredients prepped in little bowls.
Mise en place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Makes the whole process so much smoother, more organized.
And speaking of organization, remember that social media example where we talked about splitting stories based on user roles?
Oh, right. Because regular users and, like, admins need different functionality.
Exactly. So a story like, users can manage their privacy settings is way too broad. It doesn't tell us anything specific.
It's like saying people go to restaurants.
Yeah.
Sure, but what kind of restaurant? What are they ordering? What's the experience like?
Perfect analogy. By splitting it based on roles, you get regular user can adjust their profile visibility, and administrator can access and modify user data for privacy and safety reasons.
Now we're talking. It's crystal clear what needs to be built for whom.
And that's the power of splitting those user stories. It brings that clarity, that focus, that sense of control.
I'm telling you, this whole splitting thing is a game changer. I'm already feeling less overwhelmed just thinking about it. Like, I might actually tackle that mountain of laundry this weekend.
There you go. You're already applying the principles.
It's contagious. But seriously, this has been eye-opening. From the nitty-gritty of splitting user stories to the broader implications for tackling a and Y complex project, I feel equipped with a whole new set of mental tools.
And the best part is these tools aren't limited to software development. They're applicable to any field, any project, anytime you're facing a challenge that seems a bit daunting.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of splitting user stories, here's a thought for you to ponder as you go about your day, your week, your life.
What's that one area right now where you could use a little more clarity, a little less overwhelm?
That project you've been putting off, that goal that feels just out of reach.
What would it look like to apply these splitting principles?
Could you break down that big, hairy goal into smaller, more actionable stories?
Something to think about.
Welcome to Section 10, Managing User Stories in Scrum. In this section, we'll cover the product backlog, sprint planning, the definition of done, and more.
Hey there. Ready for another deep dive? You bet. Today we're tackling Scrum user stories. You guys sent over some really interesting excerpts about how to manage them. So we're going to break down those insights into, something you can actually use.
That's right.
Okay, so you want to know how user stories actually work within this whole Scrum framework, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Scrum, at its most basic level, is a framework for managing projects, complex projects, and, it's all about breaking down these big, daunting tasks into smaller, more manageable pieces, and the way we do that is with user stories.
Yeah, like building blocks.
Exact.
Okay. Now, our source material, it jumps right into the thick of things with something called the product backlog. Sounds kind of intimidating.
A little bit, yeah.
Like a supersized to-do list.
You can think of it like a prioritized wish list for a project. It's really the central hub for everything the team needs to work on. Every desire, every feature, even like the tiniest little tweak, it all starts its life as a user story in this backlog.
Okay.
And as your material points out, we could be talking dozens, even hundreds of user stories depending on the project.
Wow. Dozens or even hundreds.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a lot of wishes. No wonder, good management is key. So how do teams even begin to prioritize what goes where on this backlog?
Well, that's where prioritization techniques come in.
Okay.
There are a bunch of different methods that teams can use, but one common one is called Moscow.
Moscow.
Yeah, MOSCOW. And it stands for must have, should have, could have, and won't have.
Okay. I see. So instead of just randomly adding things to this backlog, you categorize them based on their necessity.
Exactly. And the product owner, who's kind of like the project's air traffic controller, works with everyone to figure out which stories fall into each category.
Okay.
It's about asking those critical questions, How much value will this feature bring to our users? Is it actually doable right now, technically speaking? Are there deadlines we need to consider? It's all connected.
Right. So it's about creating order within what could be chaos, making sure the most impactful stories that kind of rise to the top.
Yeah.
But it's not a static document though, right?
No. It's constantly evolving. As the team starts to gain new insights, receive user feedback, or even if project requirements change, the backlog gets refined, reprioritized. It's just like that saying, no plan survives first contact with the enemy, or, in this case, reality.
Right. You wouldn't start building a house based on a blueprint from 6 months ago if you've since discovered unstable ground or something.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do these prioritized user stories, how do they actually turn into action? Our source material talks about sprint planning.
Right, sprint planning.
Okay.
So think of a sprint as a short, focused burst of work, usually about 2 weeks, where the team tackles a select group of user stories from that prioritized backlog.
Okay, so they pick the top 3 things on their to-do list and say, these are my priorities for the next 2 weeks, no distractions.
You got it. During sprint planning, the development team, along with the product owner and the Scrum Master, who acts as kind of a facilitator,
right,
they decide which stories align with the goals they've set for that particular sprint.
And those sprint goals tie back to the overall project goals, right?
Yeah.
So again, everything's connected.
You bet. It's about constantly moving towards that ultimate goal, one sprint at a time. But this is where it gets really interesting, especially when we're talking about taking these stories from the backlog and slotting them into a sprint.
Because what happens if, in all the excitement of choosing exciting new user stories, the team bites off more than they can chew? Our source material mentioned capacity and commitment during sprint planning.
Yeah.
What did they mean by that? So if a team realizes they've overestimated their capacity for a sprint, do they just power through it, embrace the chaos?
Not exactly. Remember, Scrum is all about, collaboration and flexibility. So during sprint planning, the team doesn't just randomly, grab user stories from the prioritized backlog.
Yeah.
They actually use their collective knowledge and experience to kind of estimate how much work they can realistically accomplish.
Okay, so there's actual, like, planning involved in sprint planning.
Yeah.
But how do you measure something like that? It's not like you can, just pull out a measuring tape for lines of code or something.
Right. It's not always straightforward. So one way teams can measure capacity is by using a metric called velocity.
Velocity.
Velocity, yeah. And it's based on the amount of work a team has completed in, like, previous sprints.
So it's like looking back at past performance to kind of get a sense of what you can handle in the future.
Exactly. So let's say a team consistently completes an average of, 50 story points worth of work per sprint.
Story points.
Story points. It's just a way to kind of measure the relative effort of different tasks.
Okay, I'm picking up what you're putting down. So a team with a velocity of 50, they would probably think twice before committing to, like, 100 story points worth of work in the next sprint.
Precisely. And if they realize that they have overcommitted, they can renegotiate the scope of certain stories, maybe break them down into smaller tasks, or even move some less critical ones back to the product backlog for a future sprint. It's all about finding that sweet spot between, ambition and realism.
Which makes total sense.
Yeah.
It's better to acknowledge, a potential roadblock before you hit it head on.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of avoiding misunderstandings and, potential roadblocks, there's another really crucial element that comes into play, which your source material highlights: the definition of done.
Right, the definition of done. See, this sounds deceptively simple. I mean, isn't it obvious when something is finished?
Well, you'd be surprised. Without a clear definition of done, you're really setting yourself up for ambiguity and miscommunication down the line. It's like assuming everyone has the same definition of clean when they're, tidying up a shared space.
Ouch, yeah.
Yeah, well,
Been there. It never ends well.
Yeah.
So how does Scrum tackle this whole definition of done thing?
So by establishing a shared understanding right from the start, the definition of done is essentially a checklist of criteria that a user story must meet before the team can collectively say, yep, this is finished through and through. It removes the guesswork.
Okay, I like where this is going. So instead of just saying, let's build a login page, you'd have a specific set of criteria that define what a completed login page actually entails. So, like, what kind of things would be on this checklist?
Great question. Our source actually mentions testing as a key element. It's not enough to just write the code. It needs to be thoroughly tested to ensure that it functions as intended. And that often involves different levels of testing, right? So for instance, for our login page, we need to make sure users can successfully log in with valid credentials, that error messages pop up for incorrect credentials, that the password recovery process works smoothly, the whole 9 yards.
So no cutting corners, even if you're, like, excited to move on to the next shiny new feature.
Exactly.
But it's more than just testing, right? Doesn't it also tie back to those acceptance criteria we talked about earlier?
Right.
We can't forget about those acceptance criteria. They're crucial for making sure that we're actually, building something that solves the user's problem in the way that they need it to.
Exactly. The acceptance criteria, they're like a safeguard against, getting so caught up in the technical nitty-gritty that we lose sight of those user needs.
Right.
So going back to our login page example, one acceptance criterion might be users can successfully log in with their Google accounts.
Right.
Until that's confirmed, through testing, that user story isn't done, even if the rest of the code is, absolutely pristine.
So the definition of done keeps everyone on the same page and helps avoid those, wait, I thought we were finished moments.
Precisely. It fosters this shared understanding and helps ensure that done really means done. And what's fascinating is that while our source material really focused on software development, these principles behind user stories and the definition of done, they can be, surprisingly powerful in other areas of life as well.
Oh, I love that. It's like Scrum for life.
Exactly.
Give me an example. How could someone apply this in a more personal setting?
Okay, imagine you're feeling kind of overwhelmed by, like, a bunch of goals you want to achieve. Learning a new language, maybe renovating your kitchen, finally writing that novel you've been dreaming about. It's easy to feel, paralyzed by the sheer volume of it all.
Right? And there. So instead of getting lost in the overwhelm, you suggesting, like, we create our own personal product backlog.
Exactly. Start by simply writing down everything you want to accomplish.
Yeah.
Just like adding user stories to a backlog. Don't worry about, order or priority just yet. Just get it all out of your head onto paper.
Okay, so I've got my giant to-do list, or my life backlog as we're calling it now. What's next? Now comes the prioritization. Which of these goals is most important to you right now? Which one would bring the most value to your life, if you accomplished it in the near future? Those are your high priority items, ready for your first personal sprint.
So instead of trying to tackle everything at once, I'm going to choose just one or two goals to focus on for a set period of time.
You've got it. And just like in Scrum, those personal sprints, they shouldn't be a year long. Break them down into smaller, more manageable chunks. What can you realistically achieve in the next week or two?
This is making so much sense. And here's where I'm guessing that definition of done comes in handy for my personal goals too, right?
Absolutely. Instead of vaguely saying I want to learn Spanish, a clearly defined goal might be, I want to be able to hold a basic conversation in Spanish. See the difference?
Huge difference. It goes from this abstract idea to something really concrete and achievable. Okay, this is blowing my mind. Who knew that a deep dive into Scrum and user stories would equip me with all these new tools for organizing my entire life?
It's amazing how these principles of effective work prioritization, clearly defined outcomes, breaking down those larger goals into smaller steps, they can be applied to so many different aspects of our lives, really.
This has been an incredible deep dive. We've gone from the nitty-gritty details of product backlogs and sprint planning to a whole new perspective on achieving goals, both big and small.
And the best part is this is just the beginning. As you start, experimenting with these concepts, you'll discover even more ways to kind of apply them to your own work and your life.
So for our listener out there, here's a little challenge. Think about one area of your life where you could use a little more, like Scrum-inspired structure. What's on your product backlog for that area? What's your definition of done? The answers might surprise you.
Welcome to the final section of this audio program, where we will recap key concepts and recommend your next steps.
Have you ever put a ton of work into a project and then, realize it's not even close to what you wanted?
Totally. Happens all the time.
It's everyone's working, but somehow they're not on the same page,
Yeah, and I think a lot of times it's because the goals just weren't clear from the beginning.
Right. It's so frustrating. So that's why we're diving into this user story mini course thing by Dijon Mashkich.
Yep.
I think this is going to be super helpful. He talks about how to use user stories to avoid some of these project problems.
Yeah, he's good at breaking stuff down so it makes sense,
Totally. 5 hours to master user stories. I'm in.
Right.
So, okay, what exactly is a user story? I mean, it kind of sounds like what it is,
Yeah.
but I'm guessing there's more to it.
Yeah, definitely. It's not just a random story. It's more about, think of it as a short description, of what the user actually wants to be able to do with your product or whatever.
Yeah.
But also why. It's about their goals, what they're actually trying to get out of it.
So it's about seeing it from their perspective, not just listing out a bunch of tech stuff.
Exactly. And there's even a format for it. As a persona, I want to action, so that benefit. It's simple, but it makes you think about the who, the what, and the why all together.
I like it. Like a little template to figure out what people actually need.
Exactly. And Majkic really stresses that part. That's where you find out their motivation, what they're actually hoping to achieve, He gives this example, it's like a music streaming app. So the user story could be as a music lover, I want to make my own playlists so that I can, listen to my favorite songs whenever I'm in the mood.
I see. So you're not just building a feature, you're actually fulfilling a need, right?
Right. And to make sure those user stories are actually good, he talks about this, the INVEST criteria.
INVEST criteria, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, testable.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
When I first saw that, I was like, oh, great, more jargon.
Yeah, it's a mouthful.
Oh.
But each part of it is really important to make sure your user stories are, clear, manageable, and that they actually, help your project succeed.
So it's not just a checklist. It's more like a roadmap or something.
Yeah, exactly. Mashkic talked about this one project. They didn't pay attention to the estimable part.
Oh.
They had these huge user stories. Impossible to figure out how long they'd take, how much they'd cost. Total disaster. Missed deadlines, developers were stretched, the whole thing was a mess.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. That's a good example of why getting those user stories right is important.
Yeah.
It's not just about being organized.
Yeah.
it can really make or break the project.
For sure. And sometimes you'll have these like big, huge goals.
Right.
Like, we're going to totally revolutionize online grocery shopping or something. You can't really fit all that into one user story.
Right.
That's where epics come in.
Epics, right. I saw that in the materials.
Yeah.
How do those fit in with all this?
So epics are those big goals, the overarching things. You know, they might take a bunch of sprints or even the whole project, too big to do all at once. User stories are like smaller chunks of the epic, manageable pieces.
So you take that big revolutionize online grocery shopping goal and break it down.
Exactly.
Like, as a busy parent, I want to be able to like quickly reorder the groceries I always get so I can spend less time shopping, more time with my family or something.
Perfect. That's exactly it. That's actually central to Agile, you know, like Scrum and stuff.
Right.
Break it down, deliver value in pieces, be able to
Yeah.
change directions if you need to.
Makes total sense. So instead of trying to eat the whole elephant, you're like, taking smaller bites
Sure.
and you can adjust as you go.
Exactly.
Now, I know Majkic has worked on projects all over. Does he talk about using these stories with teams that are like, from different backgrounds? Maybe they speak different languages?
Oh, yeah. He's like really big on that. Clear communication is important for any project. But it's even more important when you've got people from all over the place.
I bet. Things could get lost in translation so easily.
Exactly. One of the biggest things he says is to like avoid jargon.
Okay.
Just keep the language really simple and clear. You know, it makes a huge difference. He's also a huge fan of visuals.
Visuals? Like
Yeah, like diagrams, anything to get the point across without relying only on words.
Right. Sometimes a picture really is worth 1,000 words,
Okay.
especially if you're trying to get everyone on the same page.
Absolutely.
It's about finding that universal language, I guess.
Exactly. And that's good for everyone, not just people who might be working in a second language. Just makes everything clearer.
It really does. And visuals, well, they're a big part of this user story mapping thing that Majkic talks about. What's that all about?
So user story mapping, it's like you take this big wall, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you literally map out the entire user journey, like step by step. But from their point of view, not, from a tech perspective.
Okay, so like with the grocery app we were talking about, you'd start with them opening the app and then...
Right, so you'd have like browse categories, add stuff to their cart, pick a delivery time, all that, in order...
And then you put the user stories onto that map.
Yeah, exactly. So you can see the whole journey visually.
That's got to be helpful, right? Especially with a big project.
Huge. It's so easy to like lose track of the big picture.
Right.
But this keeps you focused on the user and it helps you prioritize stuff.
Makes sense. So instead of getting lost in the weeds, you have this roadmap.
Exactly. A user journey roadmap.
Now, Majkic says you can use this for all kinds of projects. Not just software. What about like, I don't know, a marketing campaign or something?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Let's say you're launching like a new product.
Okay.
Instead of just jumping into making ads and stuff, you could map out how the customer finds out about the product, what info they need, what their worries are,
So you're like mapping out their thought process from never heard of it to I want to buy it.
Exactly. And then you can target your marketing way better because you know what they're thinking at each stage.
That's really smart. Takes the guesswork out of it for sure.
Right.
Okay, so you've got your stories, you're mapping things out.
Mm-hmm.
What else trips people up with this whole user story thing?
Well, one thing that comes up a lot is, like, what about the tasks that the user never actually sees?
Oh, right, like behind the scenes stuff.
Exactly. Like technical things, database stuff.
The user doesn't care about that.
No, they just want it to work.
Right.
But it's still important, right?
Yeah.
So Majkic says you got to frame those as user stories too.
But how do you do that? Like, how do you make a database upgrade relatable?
Okay, so instead of writing as a developer, I want to upgrade the database, you would say, as a user, I want the app to be fast and not crash, so I don't waste my time.
Oh, I see. You're connecting it back to their experience.
Exactly. Even though they don't see the database, they definitely feel it if it's slow.
Right. Okay, that makes sense.
It's all about that connection,
Now, there was also something about job stories and technical stories. Are those just different names for the same thing?
They're like variations on a theme, I guess. Different formats, but same goal, clear communication. Job stories are all about like what the user is trying to get done. The format is usually like, when situation, I want to action so I can outcome.
So instead of, as a marketing manager, I want to schedule social media posts.
Right.
It would be more like, when I'm planning my weekly stuff, I want to be able to schedule posts ahead of time so I can, get other work done.
Exactly. It's all about the why.
Okay, I get it.
And then technical stories, those are more for the developers, like the nitty-gritty details.
So it's like having different tools for different jobs.
Exactly.
Yeah, and you got to figure out which one works best in each situation.
Yep. And one thing that's super important for all of this is user research.
Oh, yeah, he talks about that a lot.
You can't write good user stories if you don't know your users, right?
True. It's like trying to write a hit song without knowing what people want to listen to.
Exactly. You got to get out there and figure out what they need, what their problems are, what makes them tick, you know?
Right. It's about getting out of your own head and into their world.
Yes. And there are different ways to do that, like interviews, surveys, testing.
So you're constantly learning and then adjusting, right?
Exactly. It's not like you just do it once and you're done.
Right. It's all about being flexible, which kind of makes me wonder, like,
What's that?
how do you know when to stick to the user story format and when to just, like, be flexible and try something else?
That's a good question. He actually talks about that, and he basically says that the format, it's a tool, not a rule.
Okay.
If it's not working, don't be afraid to change it up.
So flexibility is key.
Yes. The most important thing is to be clear, focus on the user, make sure everyone understands what's going on.
Find that balance, right?
Exactly. Structure and flexibility.
So we've talked about stories, epics, mapping, different formats.
It's a lot.
It is. Anything else from this mini course that really stood out?
You know what I thought was really cool? He talks about using user stories in performance reviews.
Really? How does that work?
So instead of just listing tasks like Sarah did this, Sarah did that,
Right.
you use the user stories to show how Sarah's work actually made a difference for the users and for the company.
Oh, interesting.
So it's like instead of saying Sarah coded 5 features, you'd say Sarah's work on this feature, which came from this user story, led to a 15% increase in customer happiness or whatever.
Wow. Okay, so it's about showing the impact, not just the tasks.
Exactly. It's way more powerful.
I love that. It's about recognizing their contribution,
Yeah.
not just checking boxes.
Exactly. And it keeps that user-focused mindset going strong.
Now, are there other, like, creative ways to keep that user centricity alive in a company?
Oh, yeah. He had a cool idea for that. He suggested a user story wall of fame.
Oh, what?
Yeah, like a wall where you showcase the best user stories, the ones that made a big difference.
Oh, I love that. Like a visual reminder of the impact you're making.
Exactly. Keeps everyone inspired and motivated.
Yeah, it's like it's taking those stories and turning them into something that, like, motivates the whole team.
Totally. Keeps those values strong. You know, going through this course and all,
Yeah.
it really hit me that user stories, they're not just about, like, writing stuff down, They can really change how a team communicates, how they work together.
It's like they all have this shared language now, right?
Yeah. No matter what their job is, they get what you're building and why.
It forces you to really think about the user's needs.
Totally. It's so easy to get caught up in the technical stuff or what's trendy.
Right.
User stories bring you back to what matters. Are you actually making something useful?
This has been great. Really eye-opening to dive into the Jokic's course like this.
Me too.
It's clear that this whole user story thing, it's not just for software,
Oh, yeah, definitely. You could use these ideas for anything. A new product, customer service, even planning an event.
It's about understanding the people you're doing it for.
Exactly.
Putting the human back in human-centered.
There you go.
So if you want to, like, level up your team's communication, build better stuff, go check out this mini course. It's worth it.
Totally agree. It's a game changer.
So as you start your next project, think about this too. What would your users say if they could tell this story?
Ooh, I like that.
Make it a story worth telling, one user story at a time.
Thank you for listening to this audio program on user stories. I hope you found it valuable and enjoyable. This program was created by Dejan Majkic, author of the Agile and Scrum Blueprint, available at www.whatiscrum.org. Dejan invites you to take the next step in mastering user stories by enrolling in his user story mini course, which you can find at www.whatiscrum.org/USM. As a listener of this program, you can also enjoy a special 10% discount by using the code IWANTTHIS in all capital letters at checkout. This comprehensive course is designed to equip you with the skills you need, whether you're tech savvy or not, to boost productivity and achieve better outcomes. Thank you and goodbye.
Oh no.